And we're back in the car like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Saturday afternoon here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Alas, another downbeat, somber episode, as last night, really one of the great American success stories of the 20th into the 21st centuries, George Foreman, passed away, and we can say unexpectedly. I don't really know that it was unexpected to his family, but just following him on Instagram and other forms of social media, he seemed like he was doing okay. He celebrated a birthday, his 76th, in January, and there was a picture of him with his birthday cake and with family. And yes, he looked a little bit older, but 76 years old, right? We don't stay looking like we're 40 or 50 forever. He seemed to be in good health. He seemed to still be enjoying life. And he talked about how much he was looking forward to going off his diet and having the little bit of the birthday cake. But it is sad. Not that it would be great if he had been sick for quite some time and then passed away, but it came out of nowhere. And many people who knew him well counted him as friends. Former rivals, whether Evander Holyfield or even somebody like a Larry Holmes, who never got into the ring with George. The joke in the early 90s was they were going to fight at Caesars, and whether it was going to be Caesars Vegas or Atlantic City, they were going to headline at the Geezers at Caesars, because they were both in their 40s at the time, and in a different era, they would have both been retired and not made any sorts of comebacks. But as Larry always said, I don't think they're teaching the kids of today the same way they taught us. And he almost jokingly said, I got no business being competitive, and yet here I am. As Larry was very competitive, aside from the Tyson fight, but he beat Ray Mercer, just unbelievable. And then he fought Evander not quite as well as George did, but he fought Evander strongly. He took a couple of rounds off of him, but at no time did it look like he might knock the champ down, whereas George landed a couple of big shots in the third round, the fifth round. Evander has talked about, I thought he knocked all my teeth out with one of his punches. I walked back to my corner after I unfroze myself from getting hit so damned hard. But George Foreman is a classic American success story. As he talked about himself, he was a product of a compassionate America. And nowadays, saying something like that, you're going to get a lot of chuckles. But in the 60s, not so much. George Foreman grew up in Marshall, Texas. And I, for some reason, thought he was from Lubbock or Galveston. I didn't have it in my head that he was from Marshall. And somebody I know very well, or knew very well, at least in terms of research and preparing a film project, Y.A. Tittle, the Hall of Fame quarterback, famous quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, and then won 2 MVPs and AP Player of the Year, I think 3 times for the New York Giants. Y.A. Tittle was from Marshall, Texas, a lot older than George, I think 22 or 23 years older than George. But George talked about the fact that his life was going nowhere. He was probably going to end up in a gang or just turning to criminal activity. And he was saved by the Job Corps. And most of you probably don't know who was the person behind the Job Corps. It was a guy named, he went by Sergeant Shriver. His real name was Robert. And if the last name Shriver, you kind of squint your eyes, yes, Maria Shriver's father. The Maria Shriver, the mother of Patrick Schwarzenegger, former wife for decades of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Sergeant Shriver created the Peace Corps and the Job Corps. And George Foreman credits the Job Corps with more or less rescuing him from what would have not been a life of any of his vast potential in so many areas. He wouldn't have had the opportunity to do any of the athletic achievements or business entrepreneurial achievements without the Job Corps. And he actually became friends with Sergeant Shriver. There are pictures of them together after George defeated Joe Frazier to win the World Heavyweight Championship. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. George was going nowhere. He got into the Job Corps in Texas. I want to say that it was called the 5th Ward. I'm not very familiar with how different regions of Texas are classified. I know the shape of the state, and in terms of surface area, You start driving from one end of the state and it'll take you all day to get to the other, that sort of thing. But George learned how to box in the Job Corps or as part of what he was doing. And there are certain people who show impossible aptitudes right from the jump. And George Foreman was one of those people in a sense that, for example, people knew that young Cassius Clay was very talented when it came to boxing. Cassius Clay had over 100 amateur fights. He was super successful, not surprisingly. But Cassius Clay had more than 100 amateur fights before reaching the 1960 Olympics. He had more than 100. I think he was something like 106-2. Just a ridiculous record. He's a kid. Cassius Clay, future Muhammad Ali. That's whose shirt I'm wearing here. You beat me in a dream, you better wake up and apologize. George Foreman had 20 amateur fights before landing in Mexico City for the 1968 Olympics. Now, I'm not necessarily the greatest trivia person when it comes to amateur boxing, but I know that 20 amateur fights is not very many because most of those fights are going to have a 3-round limit. Some of those fights, he probably didn't even break a sweat, literally. For him to make the Olympics after only 20 amateur fights, it shows a level of being a prodigy beyond his future rival and future bestie, Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, and well beyond his other rival, who he dominated, but then became very friendly with, Joe Frazier, who was an enormous amateur prospect himself, and he won 1964 Olympics. And when we think about the history of boxing and the history of these three guys who were inextricably linked, and sadly they're all gone now. Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, wins Olympic gold 1960 Rome, light heavyweight. He hadn't quite filled out. Joe Frazier, Tokyo 1964, wins Olympic gold. George Foreman 1968 Mexico City wins Olympic gold. The three guys were linked when they were in the amateurs, when they were kids, they were teenagers. 18-year-old Cassius Clay, 19-year-old Joe Frazier, 19-year-old George Foreman. And George Foreman, the 1968 Olympics were a very controversial Olympics. That was the Olympics of, I forgot the name of the athlete, but that was the Olympics where there were protests going on, and there were a lot of racial politics at play. There was a lot of really negative stuff going on, depending on your perspective, of course, whether it was negative in a good way or negative in a negative way. Was it not Tommy Ryan? I don't remember the name. He was a high jumper. And he did a certain salute while on the medal stand, put his fist in the air in such a way that certain people were very upset, were very offended, but it was a very politically charged time. And you think about back home, Muhammad Ali had already been thrown out of the sport for taking a stance that the establishment, mostly white people, almost entirely white people, took exception to. Well, he's not going to play ball with us. Fuck this guy. But George Foreman was proud. He already was seeing himself as somebody who had achieved. He's a product of a successful America. Yes, we've got a lot of problems here, but I was just a street kid. I was a dead ender. I was going nowhere. And here I am, an Olympic gold medalist. And when he won the gold medal match against Chapoulis was the name of the boxer. I mean, George just fucking crushed the guy. The fight wasn't even competitive. They had to stop it in the second round. They was bleeding all over the ring. This was a top-level amateur. He was, I don't know if he was favored to win the way that George looked in the preliminary fights getting to the finals. But when George won the fight, he pulled a little United States flag out of his trunks and waved it around. And that was the first enduring image of George Foreman. It was the fact that this was a kid from Texas, just pretty much came out of nowhere, blitzed the field, wins the gold medal, and let's go. And so he went from there, from those very kind of charged times, and he didn't get involved in any of the on either side of the protests at those Olympic Games. He was just proud to have represented the country and to have won a gold medal. And if you go back to 1960, Cassius Clay was saying the exact same things. Now, that was not an Olympics where there was a lot of, let's just say, hullabaloo. There's a word you don't hear very often. But there was no real controversy in the 1960 Olympics, except for the fact that there were a couple of Eastern European competitors that may have been engaging in some form of doping, but that's a whole separate issue. 1960 Olympics, there are those that say it's the last clean Olympics, but, that's neither here nor there. But George Foreman didn't get involved in any of the political fracas that was taking place. He simply started his professional career as a boxer. And he mostly had easy fights. George was a dominant physical presence. You look at him in his pictures from the Olympics. He is 19 years old. He never worked out with weights, at least not the way the fighters of today, build muscle on top of their natural genetics, where some of these guys are just built like, brick shit houses anyway. But you look at the thickness of George Foreman's musculature, and you can compare him to, for example, Sonny Liston or Mike Tyson, who looked like a bodybuilder. And I don't know that he necessarily did very much in the way of what we would call bodybuilding type of training when he was 18 or 19, but he certainly had the look. And obviously a little bit later, Evander, same kind of thing. But George Foreman, the guy was jacked. He was jacked. He was 220 plus without a scrap of fat on him. You're not supposed to be able to do that. And then on top of it, the fact that he had this unusual set of skills as a fighter, because he came across as if he was raw. He threw a lot of weird roundhouse punches, what Ali later jokingly referred to as the anywhere punch. And he was kind of kidding, but kind of not. If you watch George Foreman, whether in the amateurs, whether in the pros, when he came back in his 40s, George could throw real tight, clean uppercuts. He could throw a booming left hook. He could throw the straight right hand, the kind of punch that took the title from Michael Moorer famously in November of 1994. But George also threw these strange windmill-looking punches where he simply would wind up and not worry about form and just get the punch to the target as quickly as he could. And you know what? If he caught you in the right spot, you're going down. The fight might be over. Didn't matter if his technique was a little bit weird, a little raw. He knew how to throw punches. He just sometimes wanted to get the blow to the target quicker and just throw that big windmill. The old washerwoman, that's what another one of Ali's great nicknames, where he talked about how George would just kind of almost come over the top and try to hit you on top of the head, which is completely illegal. Every once in a while, George would get warned by the ref, bro, stop, that's like a rabbit punch, don't do that. But he mostly had easy fights on his way to eventually a showdown with Smokin' Joe Frazier, who had handed Ali his first defeat in Ali's third comeback fight after the exile period and all of the political maneuverings and the firestorm of the late 60s, which Ali ended up getting swallowed up by, at least temporarily. Frazier was considered the favorite. I think he was at least a 2.5, maybe a 3-1 favorite. So George was a live underdog. Most people didn't think that Frazier was going to just steamroll him, but there weren't that many pundits. There weren't that many boxing scribes who expected George to just go out there and do what he did, which was completely walk over an all-time great who was undefeated and who should have been in his prime. Joe was not in his prime anymore because the first fight with Ali, it took more out of him than it even did Ali. And Ali took a hell of a whooping, as he said, in that first fight. But both guys just beat the shit out of each other for an hour. It's just like, you say to yourself, what's holding them up? How is it possible for Joe to have this much bounce in his legs in round 15 after he's been hit about 500 or 600 times by a guy who was, he wasn't known as a big puncher, but he knew how to punch. There's a difference between saying a guy can't hit. Yeah, he can hit. He's just not going to knock you down with one shot very often. George had a few tough fights on his way to the title. Few. Greg Peralta in the first fight, I think, opened up a cut. Peralta, there's a guy for you to Google. He was a sort of underrated great fighter. Never held a portion of any of even the lesser alphabet soup heavyweight titles, but he was really, really good. An attractive man. I think nowadays he would have been a bigger star with social media and everything. He kind of looked a little bit like a model or a movie star. But when George went out there against Joe, he left no doubt. It's maybe the most dominant performance that side of Mike Tyson over Michael Spinks. But what makes George's achievement against Frazier more impressive, almost everybody predicted Mike Tyson was just it wasn't going to be competitive with Michael Spinks. Spinks was not in his prime. He was a little bit past it, and he was a light heavyweight. He was a natural light heavyweight who put on weight to take on Larry Holmes, and he won a pair of pretty disputed decisions. I for sure thought that Larry won the second fight. I don't think there was any doubt. I thought it was at least a 9-6 in the second fight. First fight was kind of like Ali Spinks in 78. It was a very boring tactical fight. Neither guy really was in trouble at any particular time. Not really that great of fights. But when George went out there and just smashed Joe, and then he beat Joe Roman, who was a top contender, took him out in the first round. He broke his nose, looked like he might have broken his jaw, just absolute demolition. And then he beat Ken Norton, who had defeated Ali in a tough fight. And then the return fight was also a tough fight. Ali and Norton fought twice in 73, but George beat Ken early in the year, right around the same time that Ali and Frazier met for the second time in what would become a heavyweight eliminator. I think they called it that. The winner gets the dubious honor of getting the shit beat out of them by George Foreman is pretty much how everybody saw it, because there was it's not that people didn't want Frazier to get a rematch. There didn't seem to be much of a point. He was going to get beaten up again. He was going to get destroyed again. The matchup was just all wrong. And it's a kind of thing with Floyd Patterson in 62, where Sonny Liston knocked him out in the first round to win the title. And Floyd triggered the automatic rematch that he had, the clause in the contract. But Floyd, what are you doing? You could fight this guy 100 times. Maybe you'll make it out of the first couple of rounds a few times, but you can't beat this guy. He's too big. And quite frankly, he's more skillful than you, and he's way bigger, and he even takes a bigger shot. So if you happen to land a Sunday punch, the leaping left hook that Floyd was famous for, Sonny's just going to walk right through it. There's no process by which you could beat him. Well, they had the second fight, and what do you think happened? Sonny knocked him out in the first round again. So there wasn't that much excitement for a rematch with Frazier. But even though Kenny Norton, who George crushed in 2 rounds, and Joe Frazier, who George crushed in 2 rounds, they had both beaten Ali. The Ali fight was the only fight that people wanted to see, just because, well, George beat both guys Ali had lost to, but Ali was, even then, the public opinion was beginning to tilt in his favor. And that was the only fight that people wanted to see, because it hadn't been made before. It was as simple as that. And because Ali fought that very unconventional style, people figured, you know what, there's at least a chance. He looked really good in the second fight with Norton and the second fight with Frazier. I mean, I would say that the second fight with Frazier, he's not that far off what he was doing in 66 or 7. Not as fast. He could still move around the ring, but there were times where Joe was able to square him up and land combinations. The thing with Ali in the 60s, you could land shots, but you better really land a shot, because you're only going to hit him once. It was almost impossible to put 4 or 5 shots together, kind of like with Floyd Mayweather. Maybe you hit one big shot and you stagger him, and then what? You're not going to sustain the attack. So George respected Ali, but he didn't think that it was going to be a competitive fight, because, as he put it, I beat both guys Muhammad lost to. I liked the guy. I thought he was a great fighter, but I thought his time had passed. We could see that he wasn't as quick. I said, and also, he can't punch. And it's one of the great things that one fighter says about another fighter: he can't punch. It's not literal. They just mean they're not going to take you out with one shot. And this is one reason why George Foreman in later years said, no, I was never scared of Muhammad. Not that I wanted to go out there and, we're sitting there trading leather. He said, but I knew he wasn't the kind of guy where we're fighting and I'm winning, and then the next thing I know, I'm in my dressing room. Well, what happened? Well, he caught you. He said, I knew that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to, get hit with a shot and black out and come to 10 minutes later. I knew that I was probably going to have my way with him. I didn't think that he was going to, be that much of competition. But George didn't talk that way. He was not a boastful type of fighter. He wasn't going to predict rounds. Even Sonny Liston was so frustrated before the first fight with Ali, then Cassius Clay, that I think he held up 2 fingers as if to say, I'm going to beat this kid in 2 rounds. George didn't really say that. The closest he came to indicating where his mindset was at going into the fight was, he was asked, do you think this is going to be your most competitive title match to this point? And it's a pretty good question. I mean, it's fair. He had the Frazier fight. He had Joe Roman. He had Ken Norton. Do you think that Ali is going to give you the best match of those guys? And Foreman said, could very well be. I doubt it. So he clearly thought, I'm going to go out there, and even if he tries to run around the ring, I'm going to be ready for it, and I'm going to walk him down. I'm going to walk him down the same way that I did Joe. Well, actually, Joe kind of came to him. He walked down Joe Roman, and he really walked down Ken Norton. Norton, for all the trouble he gave Ali, similar kind of thing. Muhammad, I love the guy. He didn't hit hard enough where I had to fight backing up. I could go to him. He could come to me. We mix it up. That makes for great fights. That the irony of the Ali Norton, the 3 fights, they're all exciting fights. And Ali was not necessarily an exciting fighter, whereas George Foreman, almost all of his fights, whether in his comeback or whether in the first go round, because of the blink and you'll miss it, kind of like with Mike Tyson, where there was always a chance you'd see something incredible, blink and you'll miss it. And Joe Roman's on the ground and he's getting up and here he goes on the ground again. Or 6 knockdowns of Joe Frazier or 3 knockdowns of Kenny Norton in Caracas in 74. But George, it took him a number of years to accept the disaster of what happened in Zaire when he fought Ali. He spent a few years, I hate to say making excuses, because he always gave Ali credit, but he made a lot of excuses. And one excuse I agree with him on, it was not a real count. And by that, I mean, Zach Clayton was at 8 and George was on his feet and Zach was waving the fight over. And Zach never really explained, at least to my knowledge, well, I thought that George had had enough. I didn't see any point to continue. And even Archie Moore, who was the famous, he has the record for most knockouts in a career, Archie Moore, he said that he thought it was a good stoppage. As he put it, it might as well have been 10. It doesn't matter that George was on his feet. I'm glad the fight was over. He wasn't going to win, and he was saved from taking any more punishment. Archie, as a guy who had absorbed so many punches, George didn't need to keep going. Muhammad won the fight, fair and square. It's okay. Don't blame Zach. That's what the actual words of Archie Moore. It's okay. Might as well have been 10. But eventually George came around. And even though it is kind of crazy in a life as incredibly successful as George Foreman's, 2-time world heavyweight champion, Olympic gold medalist. I mean, he was close to a billionaire from the grilling machines, super successful entrepreneur, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, started a sitcom. He and Ali started an Oscar-winning documentary. The 2 guys got to go on stage at the 1997 Oscars. What a life. But George would occasionally ruefully point out, I'm still known best for a fight that I lost. And it's an unfortunate reality. But it's just part of the tapestry of his extraordinary existence. You don't win them all. But in the case of George, he lost that fight, and then he beat Joe Frazier again. Also not a competitive fight. Joe landed a couple of shots, but George was just, the whole fight, he was just moving forward and shoving Joe around. George was so fucking big. That's why, in the alternate version of we reboot The Matrix, and you have even 42-year-old George Foreman fighting prime Mike Tyson. I mean, Mike probably wins. But George would just be pushing him all over the ring. Mike better stay out of the way. Don't get hit by any of those uppercuts, or your as Evander said, your teeth might end up in the 3rd row. You might lose your mouthpiece. You better be careful. Like Lennox Lewis talked about, he said it would have been all downside for me because, well, of course I'm supposed to beat George. He's in his 40s. He said, but if he somehow squares me up, I'll never live it down. So you let this old man beat you. Lennox would have had to fight very carefully because nobody likes to get embarrassed. Nobody likes to have to look at themselves get knocked unconscious 10 minutes later. You want to avoid that. So Lennox is happy that he and George never got into the ring, and Evander is happy that they did. But George only lost 5 fights as a professional. He was 76-5. And for people, you think about records, and I talked about this with regards to, for example, Joe Frazier. I think Joe Frazier was 30-0, and he ended up 32-4. George Foreman, I believe, was also 30-0 or 31-0 or 29-0 when he lost to Ali. But he had a lot of more fights, and then when he came back, he had a lot of fights against what you would call subpar opposition as he attempted to build up enough confidence in him that he could compete. If not with Mike Tyson, he could compete with the second tier, contenders of the day. But after George lost to Ali, he had the incredible fight with Ron Lyle. Greatest action fight probably in the history of the heavyweight division. It's up there with Hagler and Hearns in terms of 2 great all-time fighters. I mean, Ron Lyle, in a different era, is a heavyweight champion. You know, I know he had the NABF championship or one of the other alphabet soups, but I mean as far as lineal, WBA, WBC, even WBO or IBF. But Ron Lyle versus George Foreman is as extraordinary as Hagler-Hearns. Hagler-Hearns was a little bit more one-sided. Tommy had his moments in the first round, and he opened up a cut that could have stopped, in theory, could have stopped Hagler. But the actual drama of the fight, it's more a question of, is there any way that Hearns can open that cut up worse where the ref, Richard Steele, has to stop the fight? Because if these guys just keep trading shots, Tommy can't keep up with him. Hagler's too fucking strong. Hagler was a monster in there. But I digress, as I often do. When George lost to Jimmy Young in 76, a fight that he should have won, but Jimmy Young was... The way that to describe Jimmy Young in his prime, he was like Terrence Crawford. That's how he fought. Not as good, relatively speaking, but he was very, very skilled at making you look stupid and making you look slow, even if you weren't slow. He was a counterpuncher, was not an exciting fighter, but he was a really good boxer, and he could take a pounding and regroup better than almost anyone from that era. As in the fight with George, George has moments where it looks like he's going to end the fight, and Young would he'd cover up, he'd move around, he was shifty, and he would wait for his opponents to make mistakes, and then he would capitalize. And George actually took a knockdown. He was lucky to survive that fight. He could have been stopped late. It was a close decision, but most people felt, no, Jimmy did enough, to win. And that was George's 10-year retirement after the Young fight. He said that he saw God. He had an out-of-body experience. And 10 years later, because his church, they were kind of running low on funds, and he was still young enough to fight. And honestly, he hadn't taken a real terrible beating. He certainly didn't take a terrible beating. He lost the Young fight, but it wasn't really a bad pounding. And the Ali fight, I mean, Ali landed some shots, but that also was not a fight where George took an incredible amount of punishment. His eyes were a little bit puffy, but he didn't really get beat up. He just lost. Sometimes you just lose. And so when he came back, he had a lot of very easy fights. And then right around the time, just before Mike Tyson lost to Buster Douglas, they put George in there with a former contender who was trying to work his way back up the ranks. He'd had a few title shots and lost, in Jerry Cooney, Huntington, New York native. When George destroyed Cooney, you'll see all over social media, this is one of the clips of Foreman's career that you're seeing today now that he has passed, where he landed about an 8-punch combo to put Cooney down early in the second round. After a lot of people thought Cooney had won the first round and George was maybe in a little bit of trouble there. And then he stopped him with an uppercut where he froze Cooney in place. And George delivered another shot. It didn't matter. The other shot sent him to the ground. He was just sitting there frozen. And then Joe Cortez, all but jaws of life to get George away from Cooney before he could do any more damage. When he beat Cooney, people started to take him seriously. And it's too convoluted to really get into, but George's title shot against Evander Holyfield was basically because of the Cooney fight. Because it showed, yes, Cooney is maybe a fringe contender at this point, but everybody connected to Cooney, they stood on business to say, Jerry was ready for this fight. We didn't think that George stood a chance. And he came out there and he just took our guy apart. And it didn't even look like he was working hard. So Evander ended up beating Buster Douglas in Buster's first title defense. And that's how the fight was made, that George took on Evander in April of 1991. And he lost the fight from here to there. It was a competitive fight, but I would say Evander won 9 or 10 out of the 12 rounds. There are those that would say he more or less pitched a shutout. But George was in there throwing bombs and, eating leather and just kept moving forward, kept looking to land that big shot that could turn the fight his way. Unfortunately for George, I would say he landed a lot cleaner shots. There were punches that he put onto Evander that if he had hit Michael Moorer with, that fight would have ended sooner. Because Evander, for a guy who was not a natural heavyweight, his weight was cruiser. Evander actually fought at light heavy. I think he was light heavy in the Olympics, and he was a cruiserweight. He took a hell of a shot. I mean, Evander could really take a big shot and just keep pumping out, return fire, as you saw in the Foreman fight. So when George lost to Evander, it's not that it put a damper on his career, but that was his shot. And the fight wasn't close enough where people would have been clamoring or were clamoring for a rematch. There was not going to be one. Ain't going to be no rematch like in Rocky. He continued to fight. He had a tough fight versus Alex Stewart. And then he lost to Tommy Morrison, who unfortunately is best remembered for getting smashed by Ray Mercer, the same Ray Mercer that Larry Holmes had beaten a few years earlier. It's just crazy that Larry beat Ray Mercer. He beat him from here to there. The fight was barely competitive. And Mercer, you kept waiting for him to unload. It just didn't happen. But George he was a character. He didn't box as much in that era. And he starred in an ABC sitcom in 1994, not surprisingly called George. And so when Michael Moorer, I thought that was a shitty decision. Michael Moorer beat Evander Holyfield, who had some health issues. He had the heart problems. Moorer took on George Foreman on November 5th, 1994, and fought a brilliant fight for 9.5 rounds and didn't listen to his corner man, his trainer, Teddy Atlas, who kept saying, don't stand in front of this guy. Don't stand in front of him. Just keep circling, keep circling. Of course, Atlas was much more animated than what I just did, but for reasons unknown, Moorer stopped circling. It didn't look like he was particularly tired. George had landed some shots. He might have won a couple of rounds, but he landed punches and Moorer was walking right through him. But he stood in front of George for too long. George clipped him with a right hand that didn't appear to be a loaded punch, but that Moorer in later years said, I think that I was pretty much a goner from that first shot. And then the second shot, that was it. So George won, regained the heavyweight title just over 20 years after the disaster in Zaire. And it's like, you don't necessarily ever get over a terrible loss. But if there is a redemptive quality to a greater victory, a victory when people thought you had no business doing what you were doing, Foreman had his redemption, his arc of street kid, Olympic champion, unbeatable, undefeated world heavyweight champion who was taken down a couple of pegs, turned back to boxing because he needed money, and then ended up regaining the belt that he had lost 2 decades prior. It's just an incredible story from that perspective. So he continued to fight until 1997 when he lost. He beat Shannon Briggs. The fight wasn't really that close. They gave Briggs the decision. And George, it was 1997, called it a career. And it's good. Not good that he got hosed there, but it's good that he stopped fighting when he did, because his health could have only taken more hits, no pun intended, had he continued to fight. And not that long after he retired is when he got into George Foreman Grill, the grilling machines, which made him hundreds of millions of dollars. And nobody saw George Foreman, forget winning the World Heavyweight Championship, regaining it 20 years after he lost it, but nobody imagined George Foreman as a super successful entrepreneur. That was a third act plot twist that nobody saw coming. But he just soaked it up. He lapped it up. And we don't really know what goes on in the mind of people or the minds of people, but George always came across in interviews as someone who was appreciative of the opportunities he'd been given, but the opportunities he capitalized on. Because it's not enough to just be given chances. You have to take those chances and make the most of them. And in his 76 years and 2 months, George Foreman took full advantage of almost every opportunity that came his way. He did not fumble the bag. He had chances, he took them, and he succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, probably even his own. George didn't seem like somebody who was a big dreamer, but he actualized every ounce of his potential, everything that he could have been as that street tough, that street kid who seemed like he was a dead ender by his own words. He did everything. In the words of Derek Jeter, he lived the life maybe he didn't even imagine. But let's say he did have big dreams. He more than achieved everything he could have possibly wanted in life. It's just unfortunate. 76 is not that old. It really isn't, at least not in 2025. But I'm sure we'll find out what went wrong, whether it was a heart attack or stroke or something, or maybe he had cancer. Maybe he was very sick. We don't know. And that's okay. We don't need to know today. The family can mourn and grieve his loss, but we can already remember one of the greatest boxers who ever lived. a legit all-timer who fought the best in two very distinct eras where there weren't any fighters still going except Larry Holmes, and Larry really wasn't a top contender when George won the title the first time. He fought the best in two eras and more than held his own in the second era when he should have been years washed up. There was nobody like Big George Foreman. This has been episode 476 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Saturday afternoon here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.